Hello, welcome to Unspun Live, the Herald's Politics podcast. I'm Rebecca McCurdy, the paper's deputy political editor. We're taking a deep dive this week into the cost of living crisis, child poverty, and the commitments needed to meet Scotland's ambitious poverty targets. The Scottish Government want to cut relative child poverty to 10% by the end of this decade, but evidence suggests that that won't be met. I'm joined by Chris Birt, the Associate Director for Scotland of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Welcome.
Good to be with you.
We still have about, I think, 1 in 5 children in poverty in Scotland. On those targets that I've just mentioned, what is it looking like right now?
Well, so we're some way off of them. Even the interim targets, which was supposed to be met last year, missed those. That was meant to be relative poverty below 18%. So some way to go. As you say, they need to be met by the end of the decade. So we're running out of road.
Mm-hmm. And John Swinney, the SNP leader and current First Minister, put child poverty as his #1 priority. And we've started to see other parties kind of come out and say similar things, but not necessarily match the ambition. From what you've seen so far, is it the #1 priority?
I think it's difficult to make that argument from many of the parties, really. I mean, we would need to see radical changes to our public services, to our economy, to meet those child poverty targets, which, let's be clear, I mean, who gives a monkeys about the numbers? That would be a far better Scotland than the one that we have today. I don't think any of the parties have shown the ambition we need to meet those.
Yeah, so what kind of things are you asking for? We'll get onto the manifesto commitments and whether they're actually anywhere near meeting the demand, but what are some of the things that need to happen right now?
So I think what we often hear is this battle, so-called, between social security spending and helping people into work. That is completely the wrong way to look at it. We need to invest in our social security system because we know for particular families, so for single parent families or households where people are disabled, they need that support. If we want those families to be lifted out of poverty, which all the politicians say they do, you need to invest in the social security system. But of course, there is lots we need to do, reforming the jobs market, etc. But I just wish politicians would stop making this false choice between these two vital anti-poverty measures.
It seems like there is a bit of attack on welfare right now, not just from, kind of parties maybe closer to the right, but it seems like it's coming from everywhere. I mean, we had with the Scottish Child Payment, for example, John Swinney was saying one of the reasons they couldn't increase it was because it was de-incentivize or remove the incentive for families to get back into work. So it seems like it's coming from everywhere. Are you seeing that as well?
Yeah, and frankly, I find that a bit weird. I mean, there was a study from the Institute for Fiscal Studies a couple of months ago, which looked at so-called work disincentives of the Scottish Child Payment, and basically said, those claims are exaggerated. And that's right. We never talk about the disincentives in the labour market, which stop the sort of families I was talking about getting into work. So I just, it saddens me of the amount of othering that politicians do of literally hundreds of thousands of people in Scotland who rely on a vital public service as it is our social security system. So yeah, I just want to see the end of it. It's not helping anyone.
Yeah, it kind of seems like, just listening to politicians and also reading the manifestos and interviewing them, that obsession with welfare is here to stay, and it probably will become a huge part of the next parliament as well. So how much does that, what kind of concern is that for you? Because is it on the ground, what is that doing for families?
Well, we hear this all the time. We've heard, the DWP are seen as the baddies of our public sector, because for so long they've taken this very hectoring approach, particularly once universal credit was brought in. But now constantly we hear in the media these kind of discussions around benefit spending, and it affects, if you think of all the mental health pressures that people are under already, just trying to keep the lights on and stuff, of then being judged daily on the radio, on TV, in newspapers. It's just not fair. And do you know what? It doesn't work. We have seen for 15 years the government take bullying attempts to reduce poverty by making people poorer. And oh, what a surprise, it doesn't work.
Yeah. The manifestos that we've started to see, I think we've had them all now, they all take an approach of getting families back into work, which is great, and as it should be. But do you think that there's something wrong with their approach to doing that? Is there not enough support for childcare for like families, and is it that working is just not helping families make enough money? Because obviously we see a lot of the families that are on benefits or claiming universal credit are from working families as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We mustn't forget that. Like almost 75% of children in poverty in Scotland are households where somebody's working. But let me start with the positives and then maybe move on to some of the challenges. In terms of the positives, like I think every party manifesto, maybe with one exception, has stuff about childcare in it, and recognise and hear the cry from families, particularly low-income families, but frankly, those a bit further up as well, about the cost, the lack of flexibility, etc. So they were all promoting solutions on that. That's good. But frankly, a lot of those solutions will benefit middle income and better off families more than they will low income ones. So things like putting things through the tax-free childcare system or targeting the support at working families is excluding the very people who need the support. Yeah. People aren't in work because they can't afford that childcare, particularly for children under 3 or 4 who don't get the free stuff just now. So that's a big issue. Yeah.
What about the SNP in particular and the Greens as well? They take an approach of universal policies for everybody and not just for those kind of evaluated to be the most in need. Would you rather that policies were maybe means tested a bit more? Obviously, things like free university tuition, probably wider impact is for the good. But is there anything there that you think we need to stop offering universal policies and actually really target it, a really small group of people who really, really need it?
Yeah. So I think it's something where, frankly, we just do need a bit more honesty in a political discussion. It's okay to be torn between universal services and targeted services. Universal services come about for very good reasons. The childcare expansion is a really good example. The take-up of that is huge. It's 90-odd%. And if the more targeted element for 2-year-olds, it's much lower. So universal services do have their benefits, but we shouldn't kid ourselves. Public finances are really tight at the moment. So we think childcare is a really good example where what we should have is a service that is universally available to people, which is not at the moment because poor families are locked out, but doesn't need to be universally free. So I think the subsidy should be aimed towards those low-income households and frankly in kind of lower middle-income households, because we see the price of childcare is eye-watering. And then we ask people to contribute based on their ability to pay. So if you're wealthier, you pay a bit more. I think that's fair, particularly in the context of the current public finances.
Do you think it's the case, though, that those kind of policies don't win votes? And also the people who, not to make an assumption, but I'm going to make an assumption, the people who vote typically are, maybe from more middle class or more middle income earners. And so maybe in order to win votes, they do target things towards everybody and not just by asking people to pay more. Maybe it's kind of people might not like that, so let's not do it.
I mean, obviously. Yeah. I mean, really obviously. And I get that. But I also think people aren't daft. And also people, I don't think are as frankly selfish as made out. So we did some polling earlier this year where we asked people, do you think the cost of living crisis affects everybody in the same way? And the majority of people said, no, of course it doesn't, because of course it doesn't. So I think what we need is politicians being bold about, look, we can change our society in these important ways, but to do that, we need to make changes in what we do just now. And I think, as I say, that childcare one's a really good example. Even better off families struggle with a cost. So even that off for people, make it easier for most people to afford, but that most of the benefit goes to low-income households who, if it works well, won't be low-income households anymore. And then they'll start to contribute in all these kind of things. I think most people would buy into that, because there are other areas where, like council tax reform, perfect example of what you're talking about.
Yeah. I think one of the other kind of headline policies, you've probably seen it all over the front pages and stuff, is this SNP commitment to cap food prices. There's been a bit of a stooshy about whether that can actually be achievable or not, but would that be the kind of policy that you would welcome? Or is it a case of, let's actually spend time getting policies that will make a difference, that we can implement, and not just maybe headline grabbers, but that's my word and not yours, of course.
Yeah. I mean, I used to be a government lawyer, so there is a bit of me that kind of twitches at some of this stuff. But do you know what? Like, goodness, I don't know enough about the food wholesale market around whether this would constrain supply and all this sort of stuff. But do you know what constraint we do have in shops at the moment is demand is lower from low-income households because they can't afford enough of what they need.
Yeah.
And I do think it's easy sometimes to attack policy, but what's your alternative? People are pissed off at the moment because they feel hard done by. They see prices going up and they think, well, who's doing well out of that? Because it sure as hell isn't me. I'm struggling to put that bread and milk and eggs wherever on the table. So who's on my side? Who's fighting my corner? So absolutely, should politicians be offering solutions that they might not be able to deliver? Of course not. I'm sure the SNP think they can deliver that. And so if they do get into government, well, people will be thinking, right, where's that legislation? Because these prices are going up now. You better make that happen. But for everybody else too, how are you, when you're on that doorstep facing people who are saying, well, I keep my heating off half the time. It's freezing. This weather's been terrible this year. What are you doing for me? I think people deserve a good answer to that.
Yeah. I'm aware that I've spent a lot of time asking about SNP policies, so I'll turn to Scottish Labour. In their manifesto for specifically things like poverty and cost of living, family issues and stuff like that, it felt like a lot of those policies were already existing Scottish Government commitments. Maybe they hadn't been introduced yet. So free breakfast, the Scottish Government's already said they will do that. Maybe it's a case that Scottish Labour don't obviously believe that the SNP are the right ones that can bring that in. They wouldn't increase the Scottish child payment, they would just maintain it. And then the other one was childcare. It was the same commitments as well. How concerned are you about the lack of ambition in these manifestos?
I think this is something we've now seen for a long time in Scottish politics, of people who kind of maybe share the diagnosis that we would make of the issues and the problems that families are facing, but then the kind of prescription not quite being strong enough. And I think that's the thing, because there are also things within the Labour manifesto which are welcome around, like supporting people into work. It's relatively low numbers. We're constantly putting things through the prism of, well, what's wrong with that individual, rather than what's wrong with the jobs or the other barriers that are there for them. So yeah, it's welcome that people are focused on the things that are important, but people expect more and they're right to.
Yeah. On kind of looking away from the election and when the next government is decided, regardless of who that is, will these policies ever come to fruition? Or are they just going to be, part of an election campaign that we never really see any further work on?
Well, I'm going to put an optimistic spin on it, because I think if you look at these manifestos, in the main, the things promised in them are meh. But from my perspective, they are focused on some of the things that could make a difference. So childcare, mental health treatment, housing, things like that. So, who knows what the next government will look like, but it probably will rely, it just won't be one party making all the decisions. So more of the parties will have a say in the outcomes of stuff. And I think the job of people like me and holding these politicians to account will be to say, right, you talked about childcare, mental health, housing, whatever. Like, let's do something proper here. Yeah. Let's make a big difference in people's lives. And I do fundamentally believe that most politicians go into politics to improve the lot of people in their communities. And I think you just need a bit of a shove to go a bit further. I hope that's what happens after the election.
On these targets, the commitment to reduce relative child poverty to under 10%, and then I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but absolute poverty was under 5% by 2030. On those commitments, the Scottish Government published a delivery plan just before Parliament broke up for the election. Campaigners, if I'm right in saying, were not too happy about it. They felt it lacked ambition and it really didn't push the country any further to meeting those targets. what was your take on it? I think we spoke at the time, but yeah, remind us what you thought.
I think the word I used was timid.
Yeah, I think it was.
And I think that's right. It was, again, all the right issues, but not very much there. Whoever's the next First Minister needs to take that delivery plan, put it to one side, and concentrate on something that will actually meet those. That delivery plan will never meet those targets. We need to be much more focused, determined, radical in what happens after the election. Otherwise, I think it would be 100,000 children would be lifted out of poverty if those targets are met. If that's not a better Scotland, I don't know what is.
Yeah. What is the kind of best action that you've seen so far from any government, UK or Scottish government, to reducing or to taking steps to reduce child poverty?
So I think there's two we've seen so far. I think one is the Scottish child payment. I mean, like, we tack on to that the abolition of the 2-child limit, which is a horrible policy, which deserved to have been a long time ago. But I also think the investment in social housing in Scotland has been absolutely crucial, because not only does that keep people's costs down, but you do see them in a lot of communities across Scotland. These are good, energy efficient homes, which are cheap for people, a platform to build people's lives on. I think all the parties recognise the importance of housing, but we need an absolute fervour for new, good quality, affordable, and by affordable, I generally mean social housing all across Scotland, because that unlocks so much for people.
And obviously there is a housing emergency as well, where I think it's more than 10,000 children are in temporary accommodation, so don't have a permanent home. There has been some pledges to fix that, but so far nothing seems to be bringing that figure down. The government says they're going to create, and whoever is the next Scottish government as well, also says every party has these plans to build more affordable homes, but it also looks like that's another target that might be missed. I think the SNP's target was 110,000 affordable homes by 2032. I mean, I suppose we always talk about poverty and then maybe sometimes forget about housing and how important that is. But if those targets aren't met, obviously the child poverty targets will come first, and then there will be this one. But do you have any thoughts on these kind of targets being set? Does it frustrate you when targets are set and they're overly ambitious? Would you rather that they were just lower and honest, or what's your thoughts?
I keep them higher and meet them.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the thing.
Yeah.
I think, I think it's fine for the Scottish government. They did this a couple of years ago, but then I think just meandered for a while, of saying, like, the housing emergency, the people in temporary accommodation, that's our immediate priority. So we have to turn over every rock to improve lives. Now, I don't think they did very much until recently, but we do start to see, because it's focused in particular councils about starting to flip temporary accommodation to permanent accommodation, using purchasing of homes rather than building new ones. These are the kind of things that would really help that temporary accommodation number. Now, frankly, it probably don't help an awful lot with that big 110,000 number, but frankly, I don't really care if the lives of, a kid in temporary accommodation might not know which school they're going to in the next term. That's not good enough. Nobody should live like that. So I think it's okay for governments to be honest and say, look, if we're going to mean that there's nobody rough sleeping, that homelessness goes down, and that people not in temporary accommodation, that requires a more urgent, slightly different response to, right, we do need to ensure that the housing market in Scotland is healthy and there's a good proportion of social homes available in Scotland. Because the Scottish child payment's great, don't get me wrong, but our social housing stock is just as important, probably more important than that single payment to keeping poverty levels relatively low in Scotland.
So you've kind of mentioned you like to take the optimistic approach. And so with that in mind, when you look to the future, the next Scottish government, how confident are you that child poverty and poverty generally is going to remain a focus? Because obviously we have talked about that welfare, the kind of negative spin on welfare sometimes. Are you concerned that it might be pushed down the priority list?
I'm not really, to be honest, because I think it's the reality of so many people's experiences. And if a politician's any good, they will understand what's happening in their community. There aren't many communities in Scotland that are not touched by hardship. And so my optimism, I think, is also tinged a wee cloud of darkness, frankly, in that whoever wins this election, they are going to be on a burning platform of public attitudes. Like people, we've been having debates so far in this campaign about which of the leaders is the least unpopular. It's supposed to be which is the most popular.
Yeah.
So whoever wins, not going to be come bouncing into government. They're going to have to do things that improve people's lives, or a bit like we've seen with the UK government down south, people's patience runs out fast. So the way to tackle that is to take actions on the big things that matter to people. I do think that's things like child poverty and things connected to it, like housing, like our social security system, and like our public services that we all need.
Yeah. So maybe it helps that people are so kind of dissatisfied with politics and with politicians, because it might actually hold them more accountable than they kind of have been recently.
I think so, because I mean, you'll speak to more politicians than me, but like the ones I'm speaking to at the moment, like they're getting a kicking on doorsteps.
Yeah.
They're not having a lot of fun. You know, I used to be a civil servant, so I used to think it was a bit weird sometimes. Politicians would come back from an election and be, oh, I've had a great time. I've been out with my banners, and I would just think, oh, I'd rather be in the house. But a lot of them just now are just getting from lots of different parties, and it's not just one, are having a hard time. The way to change that is to improve people's lives. I still have faith that our politics should do that. Hopefully those politicians would come in to Holyrood and in just a few weeks' time have the same faith. But you'll only meet that if you get stuff done, change stuff in people's lives. That's what will improve people's view of politics.
Okay, well, thanks very much for coming on the podcast. It's been great to get your views, and I'm sure when there is a new government, we'll be back in touch on whether people are actually meeting their commitments. But thanks very much.
Right, great to chat.